Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT ranked meta video. Our analysts are here to go through the 11.6 meta for each stage of the game. We'll be recapping the meta in terms of items, compositions, and the general how to play during the early, mid, and late game. While we're still in a Slayer-centric meta, there's plenty of other options, which has led to an all-around balanced meta. With all that said, let's go ahead and dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. As we usually do, let's start off by covering the current meta for items. There hasn't been much of a shift in the meta for items as the last few patches have been rather small in terms of the amount changed. What worked last patch will continue to work in 11.6, so the most contested component is still going to be the glove. But we have seen sword not be as high of a priority as both rod and bow are necessary components to have for certain builds. Glove builds in the most common meta items, whether that's for magic focused champions or champions that focus on auto attacks. Players still hesitate to slam too many early items, but if you do snag an early glove, you can always make one of the best all-around items, Hand of Justice. If you're looking to play more specific builds, you can use the glove to make a jeweled gauntlet, which is great for champions like Aurelion Sol, or you can play the opposite route with Last Whisper on items like Olaf and Tryndamere. And in the mid to late game, you've got an extra glove you can always use for Quicksilver, Infinity Edge, or Shroud. Bow and Rod, on the other hand, build into more specific items. Rod is used for Jeweled Gauntlet, Death Cap, Morellonomicon, and Gunblade. Bow, for the most part, is all about Kale items with RFC and Rageblade, though you do need a bow to make Last Whisper. Either component is fine to grab early, but keep in mind they don't build into that grade of early game items, with the exception of Rod that can be used for Locket. Sword is still a great choice to grab early as it can build into a lot of different items such as Deathblade, Gunblade, and Infinity Edge. The best item you can make from a sword is definitely Guardian Angel, but it's more of a mid to late game item as you really don't have to prioritize it early game. Speaking of mid to late game items, that's where Chain Vest is the strongest as it builds into a lot of defensive items like Guardian Angel, Shroud, and Titan's Resolve. That said, Chain Vest can also be used in the early game for Sunfire Cape. Tier is definitely lower on the priority unless you need one to make Hand of Justice from the second carousel. Otherwise, you can skip it until the mid game where it's mostly used for Chalice. The only other common use for Tier is in conjunction with a spatula to make a mage item, which is especially good on Swain. And that leaves us with Belt and Cloak, neither of which are all that important early game with the exception of Belt for Sunfire Cape. That's not an item that you want to force as much anymore, and only build it naturally if you hit it off of the PvE rounds. Overall, if you need either of those components, you'll generally never have any issue procuring them in the mid game. All in all, the item meta hasn't changed much for quite a few patches now. With items covered, we can now shift over to talking about each stage of the game, beginning with the early game. We'll be breaking down the early game in two ways, with the first being early game leveling. The plan is to level early if you're not playing for a loss streak. In general, it's risky to play for a loss streak even with fortune, so we recommend not doing that unless you're experienced with it. Everyone else should be aiming to hit level 4 on either 2-1 or 2-2. Even though they did lower the cost of hitting an early game 2 cost chosen, it's still worth a chance, and having 4 units on an early board is key to mitigating health loss or to winning rounds. We recommend only pre-leveling to 5 at the end of 2-3 if you're unable to hit 10 gold, otherwise level at the standard interval of 2-5. While building up your economy is important, saving health is even more so. Leveling early will reduce the amount of damage you take, and you will still be able to, on average, hit around 20 to 30 gold by the end of Krugs. Next, for the early game, let's talk about early game champions and traits. This will depend a lot on RNG as you don't really have control over your shops and how much gold drops during PvE. On average, you're meant to get around 5 to 6 gold, but it varies when you can get it. So players that have gold drop on the first round can buy more units than players that didn't get gold until the last round. It's minor overall, but can dictate how well the early game goes for you. Keep in mind that the number one rule of thumb is to play your strongest board. That means buying pairs and trying to hit a 2-star unit while forming a basic early game board, which usually consists of a damage dealer and a frontliner. There's a ton of variation at this stage of the game, but any 3-cost unit can do well as a damage dealer. As for 1-cost units, Tristana is by far the best of the bunch, even if you're unable to 2-star her. Other units to consider are Twisted Fate, Brand, and Nasus. In terms of traits, you can really run anything as long as it fits well with whichever chosen you end up playing. For example, if you get a chosen Nidalee, you can augment her by playing Warlord and Sharpshooter units. As for what chosen to play, the thing to keep in mind is not to be greedy. Consistently skipping past chosens is a surefire way to lose a lot of health. Buying a Chosen and selling it later is completely fine to do, so don't be greedy. For traits, again, the goal is to play off the Chosen you have, but a few strong ones to consider are Warlord, Cultist, and Keeper. Mage also does well, especially with the Chosen, as you can hit 5 Mage quite early. Lastly, there's Fortune. Only play Fortune if you're comfortable with it, as it is the easiest way to bait yourself into losing a lot of health for no immediate benefit. Let's now move into the mid game. This begins around 3-2 and it ends during the latter half of Stage 5. It's the most important part of the game, as preserving health during Stage 3 and 4 helps players consistently place in the top 4. Speaking of Stage 3, on round 3-2 or the round after, plan to level to 6. At this point, you can decide whether you need to roll or not based on how badly or well your board is doing up to this point. If you're losing health each round, it's likely necessary to sell your current Chosen and roll to stabilize. Stabilizing at level 6 is simply finding your main damage dealer, usually a 3-cost unit, and a sturdy frontline. The actual champions and traits don't matter as much as having a cohesive board built around a champion that can do good damage. Options to consider here are Kennen, as he can both frontline and deal damage. Sivir is another strong option because of her traits. As for traits, Cultist and Warlord are still the best during Stage 3 and 4 if you can hit 6 of them and upgrade the 3-cost carry for each respective trait. Brawlers and Vanguards are the best option at this stage of the game for frontline, though an early Shen can be just fine. Keeper is also great since it boosts the defense of your board with shields. From level 6 and on, the plan is to save money to once again evaluate your board at level 7 on 4-1. If you didn't need to roll much at level 6, then you likely should roll a bit here. Overall, the same idea applies at level 7 as it does at level 6. Look for a damage dealer, good frontline, and upgrade what you can. The difference at level 7 compared to 6 is you'll begin to form your mid-game comp. There's a lot of options in the current meta. At the top, we have multiple variations of Slayer, which is thanks to the flexibility of the champions. Olaf, Tryndamere, and later on Samira are all viable carries, so playing around them is easy to do, especially since Slayer can be run just as a 3-piece trait. Mage is similar in flexibility, except you absolutely need Aurelion Soul. On the plus side with Aurelion, you can skate by with him just being a 1-star unit as long as you have the Mage trait, a frontline, and 1 or 2 items for him. Then there's Kale, who for the most part requires a bit of high rolling, as you absolutely need Kale too with specific items. But if you can secure those and build a composition around her, you'll be set for the rest of the game. It's worth noting that Kale did receive a nerf in the B patch, so she may fall down in priority as players get used to playing with those changes. Lastly, there's Keeper, which hits its main power spike during Stage 4 and 5. After that, it can struggle if you don't hit Xayah 2, as well as you do need a Kennen 3. But for the mid-game, having 4-6 Keeper with a Kennen 2 as your frontline is still quite strong. Besides those compositions, there's plenty of other options such as Sivir carry, which can be done with either Sharpshooter Spirit or Cultist. Vanguard Mystic Fable just received a buff in the B patch as Nico does more damage. Talon Morgana is also an option, same with Brawlers and Dragon Soul. Basically, find a carry, add in a frontline with some additional splash traits. Vanguards are a bit weaker because of Last Whisper, so Adept has risen up in popularity for frontline, though Sejuani is still top tier. For splash traits, there's Mystic, Siphoner, and Spirit, plus any additional traits for your main carry, such as Divine for Kale. There's plenty more we could cover for meta composition, but let's now move on and talk about the late game. This generally begins near the end of Stage 5 and continues until, well, the end of the game. Let's backtrack for a moment and talk about level 8. Commonly, this is done anywhere between 4-5 and 5-3. The deciding factor for when to level to 8 is how much health you have and whether or not you're willing to lose some health for a greedier level 8. In general, the guideline to follow here is level 1 you'll have at least 30 gold left over, so you can roll if your board is weak and need to get strong right away. Now, for the late game, there's a few key aspects to keep in mind. First is that the late game in terms of champions is all about legendary units. Samira, Swain, and Lee Sin are all ridiculously good late game, so most players gravitate towards playing them if possible. Whether that's as a carry in the case of Samira, frontline for Swain, or just utility like in the cases of Lee Sin. Whichever way you go about it, adding in 5-cost units is the easiest way to strengthen your board besides 2-starring your existing champions. One quick thing to note is Ornn. Ornn is fantastic when you put him in on your board, but often isn't worth it the later the game goes on. It's really a judgment call as to whether you want to wait up to 4 rounds for an artifact. As strong as artifacts can be, sacking one spot on your board for multiple rounds is not always worth it if you're low on health. The other aspect of the late game is leveling to 9. Level 9 is certainly more common nowadays than it has been in the past for set 4, but in general, it's not worth it if your board is struggling. Sure, if you're winning rounds and have nothing else to upgrade besides 5-cost units, then leveling is fine, but if you're bleeding health, you're better off rolling to stabilize your board. It's not worth leveling if you have no gold left over to roll and end up losing the next round because you didn't spend your gold in a meaningful way. And lastly, there's scouting and positioning. Scouting is easy as it's more about building a habit than anything else, since the goal is to look for threats against your board. Positioning, on the other hand, is harder to teach because it depends so much on your composition and the boards you're up against in the specific lobby. Overall, just make sure you're scouting often and maneuver your board in response to what you scout. Don't get caught by obvious threats like Aatrox, Zephyr, or Shroud. All in all, when it comes to the late game, what matters most is how well your early and mid game went. If you can strengthen those parts of your game, you'll have a much better late game, which translates into placing well consistently. And that's going to be it for today's video, folks. Overall, the meta is healthy and stable, which is a great send-off for set 4 as a whole, since we're moving closer and closer to the end of the set. Let us know in the comment section below whether or not you're enjoying the current meta and what you're looking forward to being changed in the upcoming 11.7 patch. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.